G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. In this session, we're up to session 4. We're looking at chapter 3, verse 22, down to chapter 5, verse 4. Finished off last session where we saw the commission of the prophet Ezekiel. He's commissioned to be a prophet to the nation of Israel. It's a nation that's not going to hear him. Wonderful start to his ministry. Why? Because they're a rebellious house. They're hard-hearted, but God is going to make Ezekiel even harder than they are to withstand, their hard-heartedness. He is to carry God's word to his fellow Jews who are in exile. He's not going to be coming back to the Jews in Israel or in Judah, but he's going to be dealing with the ones in exile, despite the reception he's going to receive from them, because it's not going to be a very good reception. We see the vision of the cherubs that he initially saw in the Shekinah glory that begins to move, and Spirit now carries him along, and he went being lifted along by the Shekinah glory, by the Spirit. He went along feeling two things: bitterness and bitterness, and in the heat of his spirit, it says, as to whether he would accept the call or not, because the messages were going to be pretty difficult. But the hand of Jehovah was very strong on him, so he didn't have a choice. He had to accept the call. Ezekiel is now called to be a watchman unto Israel. That means he's to give warning to two groups of people. He's to give warning to the righteous and to the wicked in the land, and he's to warn them of the dangers to come. And God says to him, if he fails to warn them, the righteous or the wicked, if he fails to warn them of the dangers, that his own life could be in danger of forfeit. And that's where we left off last session. Now we're into this session here, and we're going to see the prophecies of judgment on Judah, which is going to take us from chapter 3:22 right down into chapter 24, verse 27. And what we're going to see here is most of the issues are going to be about Judah, although he does deviate a little bit here and there. And they're primarily negative prophecies, but for a few exceptions, which we'll be dealing with the coming judgment. Now, prophecies of the fall of Jerusalem, and we're going to see from chapter 3, verse 22 down to chapter 7, verse 27. This deals with the prophecies concerning the fall, and it also, we hear in chapter 22 to in verse 22 to 27, we see the dumbness of the prophet. So this is actually an introduction into the entire main section or division of this book. Now, when we get past the second main section, things will begin to change in relationship to his message to Israel. So in verses 22 to 23, and the hand of Jehovah was there upon me, and he said unto me, arise, go forth into the plain, and I will there talk with thee. Then I arose, went forth into the plain, and behold, the glory of Jehovah stood there, as the glory which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. So the vision of the Shekinah glory now reappears for the second time. First appearance was to call Ezekiel to the prophetic office. The second time it appears is to actually cause him to begin his prophetic ministry in a very practical way. So the Shekinah glory reappears to him and gives him an order. He is to arise and go forth into the plain. Now, the Hebrew word can mean either plain or a valley. Probably a better translation would be to go to the valley. This is where God is going to talk with him. And this is the first of at least 2 times he's going to be in this valley. Now, the next time we see him here is in chapter 37, where the whole valley is full of dry bones. Chapter 37 is the valley of dry bones. That's where we're going to see him next time in the valley. But at the time of his first visit to this valley, those bones are not there yet. Why? Because this time he goes before the collapse of Jerusalem. And the next time will be after its downfall. So the purpose of him going to this valley is so that once he gets there, God is going to reveal certain things to him. He says, and I will talk with thee there. So in verse 23, then I arose and went forth into the plain. He went out into this plain or valley, and once he arrived there, he once again sees the vision of the glory of Jehovah, which he's seen back in chapter 1. The result is exactly the same thing. I fell upon my face. So now, same as we saw back in chapter 2, verse 2. So we see here in chapter 3, verse 23, Holy Spirit now enters into him, sets him back on his feet so that he is ready now to hear what God has to say to him. Then the Spirit entered me and set me upon my feet, and he spoke with me and said unto me, Go, shut thyself within thy house. So he receives 3 instructions here, 3 things about how to begin acting out his prophetic office. In verse 24, he's told to go and shut himself within his house. This means that for the time being, Ezekiel is to refrain from any public ministry. Don't go outside speaking about anything. He's not to go out to the people to proclaim the word of God, as Isaiah did, or as his own contemporary Jeremiah was doing back home in the land of Judah. So although his ministry is not to be public in that sense, we're going to see in chapter 14, verse 1, people could actually come to his home to receive the prophecies that he was getting from God. However, at this particular time, he was instructed not to go out to them, but to stay within the confines of his home or its immediate surroundings. So also in verse 25, but thou, son of man, behold, they shall lay bands upon thee, and shall bind thee with them, and thou shalt not go out among them. So the prophet is going to be bound. They shall lay bands upon thee. Now the question here is, who do they represent? There are 2 possibilities here. One could be the other exiles who will bind him upon his bed, but more likely, when we get to chapter 4, verse 4 to 8, before too long, what will bind him to his bed will be the words of God, they being the words of God. He's going to have to lay there bound for a certain length of time so as to teach a specific lesson, which we'll deal with when we get to chapter 4. So he's to stay around his home. He's to be bound in bed for a period of time. He's not to go out and mingle among the people, but to stay close to home. The people have to come to him if they want to hear anything. In verse 26 to 27, 3rd thing, Ezekiel is also going to be dumb. I will make thy tongue cleave to the roof of thy mouth, that thou shalt be dumb. Now, we will describe what the nature of this dumbness is in a minute. But the reason why God causes Ezekiel to be dumb is so that thou shalt not be to them a reprover. God will not have Ezekiel reproving the people in his own words. That would be his natural tendency to react against them, because, as God has said before, and he says again at the end of this verse, for they are a rebellious house. And because of the rebellious nature of the people of Israel, even those already in exile, Ezekiel's own tendency is to begin reproving them beyond the point that God has revealed any such reproving. So in verse 26, God is going to make him dumb to a certain degree. But in verse 27, this did not mean he was to become mute. God says, but when I speak with thee, I will open thy mouth, and thou shalt say unto them, thus says the Lord Jehovah, he that heareth, let him hear, he that forbeareth, let him forbear. The point here is this: he is not going to be altogether a dumb mute. This will just be a ritual dumbness. He's to say absolutely nothing unless God actually speaks to him and gives him something to say. When Ezekiel speaks, it is because God is speaking. When he's silent, God is saying nothing. So for a period of time, then, he's to say nothing except when God is actually speaking. And that is to be the policy, whether they'll hear or forbear. Most likely, they'll forbear, because once again, God says for the ninth time so far, for they are a rebellious house. Now, it's a quick summary of this session. Well, not really a quick summary, but a summary. He's not to be a dumb mute as such, but only to exercise a ritual dumbness. It's quite evident as we read through that his dumbness was not absolute. And this state of dumbness is actually going to last for 7.5 years. Yet during that time, he's going to speak in chapters 4 down to 33. But he only spoke when God spoke, as he was receiving revelation from God to be passed on to this rebellious people. So for the first 7.5 years of his ministry, he spoke only when God spoke, and he kept silent when God was not speaking. This was going to last until there came a turning point, and this would be when a messenger or better, a refugee arrived from Jerusalem to tell the exiles in Babylon that the city of Jerusalem had finally been destroyed. Now, if we look at the end of this section here, which is in chapter 24, at the end of this 7.5 year period, when it's drawing to a close, chapter 24, 26 to 27 says this, that in that day he that escapeth shall come unto thee, to cause thee to hear it with thine ears. In that day shall thy mouth be opened to him that is escaped, and thou shalt speak, and be no more dumb. So shall thou be a sign unto them, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. So when the refugee arrives from Jerusalem to tell them that their city has been destroyed, Ezekiel will be released from his ritual dumbness, and he'll now be able to speak freely again. And then going on into chapter 33, verses 21 to 22, we reach a turning point here, mentioned earlier. Here is where it comes. It's in conjunction with the arrival of the refugee or the messenger and Ezekiel's dumbness. And it came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity, in the 10th month, in the 5th day of the month, that one that had escaped out of Jerusalem came unto me, saying, the city is smitten. Now the hand of Jehovah had been upon me in the evening, before he that was escaped came. And he had opened my mouth until he came to me in the morning, and my mouth was opened, and I was no more dumb. So there we go. Waiting for the messenger or refugee from Jerusalem. So once the messenger arrives, the issue of Ezekiel's dumbness will finally be resolved. Now, where it says in chapter 3, verse 26, that he would not be unto them a reprover, he's not reproving them when he speaks the prophecies God gives him. Sorry, he is reproving them. He is reproving them when he speaks the prophecies that God gives him. So in what sense is he not to be a reprover? Well, the difference is that he's not speaking in his own words, but he's speaking the words of God. He's not to speak in his own words because they are a rebellious house. The point is he was not going to be allowed to react to their rebelliousness by reproving them in his own terms, in his own words. And this can be compared to Moses, for instance. Moses' experience, when he smote the rock the second time, he reproved the people when God had not done so at that point. And as a result, he was not allowed to enter the promised land. So consequently, what we see here is Ezekiel is a reprover, but only when God speaks. He's not allowed to reprove them on his own. Okay, now, see some symbolic actions now. You're going to see this is from chapter 4, verse 1, down to chapter 5, verse 17. He's going to perform 4 symbolic actions, which will be all occurring around the same time. First sign we see is the sign of the tile. We see that in chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. Thou also, son of man, take thee a tile, lay it before thee, and portray upon it a city, even Jerusalem, and lay siege against it, and build forts against it, and cast up a mound against it. Set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it round about. And take thou unto thee an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between thee and the city, and set thy face toward it, and it shall be besieged, and thou shalt lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Okay. So the first symbolic action here concerns this tile. This would have been a clay tablet made of soft clay, and it would be used for writing inscriptions. And once you're writing it, you then would bake it hard and make it durable. So Ezekiel is to take one of these soft clay tablets, but instead of writing on it, he is to virtually is to draw a picture on it or a portrait on it. He is to engrave the outline of the city of Jerusalem on this tile. And having done this, then he is to lay a siege against it and portray that on the tile. Then he is to set this picture on the ground and start to use what he can to find on the ground to make models of things that would indicate the city was being besieged. He's playing soldiers. He's playing with toy soldiers type thing. He's going to do this by first building. He's going to build some forts against it. He's going to make a mound around it. And then he's going to set military type camps around it. And then he's going to plant some battering rams against it. So people passing by and looking at his picture on the ground and his model would be able to visualize a city under siege. Now, along with these things, in verse 3, he said, take this iron pan. He says, take an iron pan and set it for a wall between thee and the city. So this would have been one of those flat iron pans used for baking. It was also the type of pan used for the baking of the meal offering in Leviticus 25. So this would be something that Ezekiel would be very familiar with, since he himself was a priest. So the iron would be emphasizing the strength of the besieging army. And God tells him the iron pan is to be used to symbolize a wall, and he's to set it up between himself and this clay model city. It's going to be a wall of partition between the prophet and the city under siege. Now, what do walls do? Well, walls offer protection or emphasize protection. And the point here seems to be that Ezekiel is going to be protected as he pronounces judgment upon this city. And then, having done all this, Ezekiel is to set thy face toward the city. He's to set his face in opposition to the city of Jerusalem. The fact is that God says, it shall be besieged. So this is certain. This is irrevocable. The city is going to be besieged. Now, God's purpose in having Ezekiel do all this is so that it should be a sign to the house of Israel. So what he was doing right around his own home, because remember, he was commanded to stay close to home, yet it would serve, what he's doing here, would serve as a sign to the exiles among whom he now was living. And the main point of this first symbolic action was to teach the fact of the coming siege of Jerusalem. There was absolutely no doubt that Jerusalem would be besieged for a third and last time. Now we see the second symbolic act, we see the sign of the posture. This is the second symbolic sign. This is verses 4 to 8. It concerns the posture that Ezekiel was now required to adopt. And so for a specific period of time, he has to lie on his left side, and then he has to turn over for another duration of time, have to lie on his right side. Now, verses 4 to 5 deal with this lying on his left side. Moreover, lie thou upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it. Thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have appointed the years of their iniquity to be unto thee a number of days, even 390 days. So shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. So the purpose here of his lying on his left side is to symbolize his bearing the iniquity of the northern kingdom of the house of Israel. He is to lie in bed on his left side, and he'll be enabled to do this by reason of the bands that we saw back in chapter 3, verse 25, which is the word of God. He's being obedient to the word of God. So he's going to have to do this for a specific number of days, which will equal a number of years, while he bears the iniquity of the northern kingdom. The number of days, he says, is going to be equal to the number of years, and the number of days that equal the number of years is given in verse 5 as 390 days. So this symbolizes 390 years, during which time Ezekiel will symbolize the bearing of Israel's iniquities. So he's going to lie on his side for 390 days. Now, exactly what these 390, this period of 390 days or 390 years refers to has been a problem. The usual rabbinic view is that these 390 days extend from the division of the kingdom in the year 932 BC until the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. However, simple subtraction shows you that's only 345 years, not 390 years. Yeah. Looking back at the history of the Northern Kingdom, it only lasted just over 200 years. So by looking back into the past, before Ezekiel began lying on his left side, there is no period of time in Israel's history that corresponds to these 390 days. So we'll have to look elsewhere rather than going back historically before Ezekiel's time. We'll just come back to this. We'll see the other one. Now, in verse 6, and again, when thou hast accomplished these, thou shalt lie on thy right side, and shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah. 40 days, each day for a year, have I appointed it unto thee. So after he's now lying on his left side for 390 days, he has to turn over and lie on his right side. So the purpose for this is so that he can bear the iniquity of the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, in Judah's case, the bearing of their iniquity will not be anywhere near as long, only 40 days this time, and each day equivalent to 1 year. In other words, 1 day in Ezekiel's life will equal 1 year in Judah's history. Which 40-year period in Judah's history this refers to? Again, lots of debates. Usual rabbinic view is that it begins with the fall of Samaria from 722 BC onward, but they cannot decide with any certainty which 40-year period after that date this prophecy refers to. Second rabbinic view is that these 40 years begin from 626 BC. Significant thing about that date is that it was the 13th year of Josiah's reign when Jeremiah began his ministry. But again, same thing, going back into Judah's history to try and find a significant 40-year period before Ezekiel's time was always failed. So what is it? In verse 7, whether the prophet is lying on his right side or whether he's lying on his left side, he has to face Jerusalem. And thou shalt set thy face toward the siege of Jerusalem with thine arm uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it. So he's to face the siege of Jerusalem that he has inscribed on the tile or tablet. And at the same time, he's to have his arm uncovered so his arm can remain free so that he can still act out the attack on the city and the first symbolic act he has to perform, which we saw back in verses 1 to 3. As he does this, he has to prophesy against Jerusalem. In verse 8, he talks about these bands. And behold, this is God speaking, behold, I lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to the other. So this statement gives the reason why Dr. Fruchtenbaum takes the previous statement in chapter 3, verse 25 to mean the they refers to the words of God. Because it says here, behold, I lay bands upon thee. God himself will fix him in position so that Ezekiel will not be able to turn over for the whole period that he lies on one side or the other. He's to be bound in this matter till thou hast accomplished the days of thy siege. Now, 390 days plus 40 days equals 430 days, and that's equal to the symbol of the 430 years of Jewish history. But looking back historically from Ezekiel's day, it's impossible to find the 390 or the 40 years. So Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that we should look forward from Ezekiel's time because 430 years was the total number of years that Israel was in subjection to foreign powers with no national autonomy. But we can do this two ways. If we were to date it from the second deportation, when Ezekiel was taken into Babylon, it would begin in 597 BC. If we now add 430 years to that date, we get to 167 BC, which was the year of the Maccabean revolt. If we date it from the fall of Jerusalem and the third deportation in 586 BC and subtract 430 years, we get to 156 BC, when the Maccabean kingdom was established. So, whether we date this period from 597 or 586 BC, whether it's from the second or the third deportation, we arrive at the period of the Maccabees, when for the first time, the Jews once again had a measure of national autonomy. So Ezekiel has to lie down a total of 430 days to symbolize the number of years the Jews would be under total Gentile domination. The point of the first symbolic act was to teach the fact that a siege of Jerusalem will come. And the point of this second symbolic action is to point out how long the duration of national punishment will last once the fall of Jerusalem has taken place. Now we come to the sign, the third sign. This is the sign of the defiled bread. We find this in verse 9 to verse 17. Verses 9 to 12 deal with the actual symbolic act. In verse 9, he has to mix 6 different types of grain together. Take you also unto you wheat and barley and beans and lentils and millet and spelt, and put them in one vessel, and make you bread thereof, according to the number of the days that you shall lie upon your side, even 390 days shall you eat thereof. So these 6 grains have to be put into one vessel. This is one of those times when some critics say that Ezekiel is going contrary to Mosaic law, and they use Leviticus 19, verse 19, 19, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 9, Deuteronomy 22, 9. But those passages only forbid the mixing of these grains during sowing. They do not actually forbid mixing them for baking. So Ezekiel is not actually violating Mosaic law, because he's not asked to sow this mixed seed, but he's asked to take this mixed seed and bake it, make bread out of it. And it says, according to the number of days that you shall lie upon your side. Now, reference is made particularly to his lying on his left side, which symbolizes the northern kingdom of Israel. So when he's to eat bread made from this mixture of grains, this is to be his food for the entire 390 days lying on his left side. And then verses 10 to 12 gives him his ration of food. And thy food which thou shalt eat shall be by weight 20 shekels a day. From time to time shall thou eat it. So his food ration in verse 20 shekels. Now, if we take 1 shekel weight, which is equal to around about 10 to 13 grams, or 2/5 of an ounce, then that makes a total of 8 ounces of food per day. 8 ounces, or 220 grams of food per day. That's not a lot of food. Now, according to Leviticus 26, verse 26, Leviticus 26, 26, the point here is to teach that there would be a scarcity of food. And from this meager ration, due to the scarcity of food, he's to eat from it from time to time as he lays on his left side. And then in verse 11, we have his water ration. And thou shalt drink water by measure, the 6th part of a hin, from time to time shalt thou drink. Yeah, he's to drink 1/6 of a hin of water. A hin was a liquid measure equal to about 12 pints, or 1.5 gallons. So 1/6 is 2 pints, around about 950 milliliters. So his daily drink ration was only 2 pints, or 950 mil, which is not very much in the hot climate of Babylon. So he has to drink from these meager resources from time to time, as with his food. And then in verse 12, and thou shalt eat it as barley cakes, and thou shalt bake it in their sight with dung that cometh out of man. So he's told here the manner in which he will eat it. Now, the dough mixture, the baking mixture is to be made in the form of barley cakes. He's to bake it in their sight of the people. They must be able to see what he's doing, because the lesson of it is for them. He's to bake it with the dung that comes out of man. Now, listen. This obviously is not put into the bread, all right, but it is used as the fuel for baking. The use of dung as fuel was practiced throughout the Middle East because of the scarcity of wood. Now, dung, this is animal dung, was mixed with straw and allowed to dry, and the use of animal dung was acceptable, but using human dung was considered unclean, and that we can see that back in Deuteronomy 23 verses 12 to 14 there. In verse 13, we see the application of this symbolic act. And Jehovah said, "Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations whither I will drive them." So what Ezekiel is now told to do symbolically, the children of Israel will do actually when they are taken into captivity into other lands. An example of this is in Hosea chapter 9, verse 3. Now, as Ezekiel has to eat this foul bread, so Israel will eat foul bread among the nations where they're going to be taken into exile, which included both Babylonia and Egypt. Now, at this point, being a priest, Ezekiel protests in verse 14. "Then said I, Lord Jehovah, behold, my soul has not been polluted, for from my youth up even till now have I not eaten of that which dieth of itself, or is torn of beast, neither came there abominable flesh into my mouth." So the expression here, Lord Jehovah, this is an exclamation. Lord, no, he's saying. He revolts from the very idea of having to cook this bread with human dung as his fuel. He feels that this would defile him. Actually, using human dung in this way was not specifically forbidden by the law as such. It was declared unclean. So for that reason, it was not used for fuel. So God is not asking him, or he's not asking Ezekiel to do something contrary to the law of Moses, because the law didn't forbid cooking with it. But Ezekiel feels it will defile him and says he has not been defiled by polluted elements from the time of his youth to that day. He mentioned three things he had never done. First, he had never eaten of that which dies of itself. He had only ever eaten slaughtered meat. This is in keeping with Leviticus chapter 7, verse 24, and Leviticus 7:24, and Leviticus 22, verse 8, 22:8, and Deuteronomy 14, verse 21. Deuteronomy 14:21. Second, he never ate of that which is torn of beasts. So even if it might be a clean animal, he had never eaten of any that had been killed by a wild animal, because that was forbidden in Exodus chapter 22, verse 31. Exodus 22:31, and also by the two Levitical passages previously, Leviticus 7:24 and Leviticus 22:8. Third, neither came there abominable flesh into my mouth. Now, this is not referring to pork and stuff like that, but to sacrificial meat that was 3 or more days old. So anything that was 3 or more days old, that's referred to as abominable flesh. That was forbidden in Leviticus 7, verse 18, Leviticus 7:18, and Leviticus 19, verse 7. So they're the three things. He said, I've never been polluted by any of these things. Now, although Ezekiel is appalled by what God is asking him to do, even though not actually in violation of the Mosaic law, God graciously condescends to Ezekiel's scruples in verse 15. Then he said unto me, See, I've given thee cow's dung for man's dung, and thou shalt prepare thy bread thereon. So he won't have to use human dung after all. He was allowed to use cow's dung. This is something that's still done today. The Bedouin even use camel dung for fuel. Now, what's the application? The application we see in verses 16 to 17. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight and with fearfulness, and they shall drink water by measure, and in dismay, that they may want bread and water and be dismayed one with another and pine away in their iniquity. So in verse 16, this act is to symbolize the famine of Jerusalem. The expression, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, means a famine. This had been prophesied by Moses in Leviticus 26, verse 26. Leviticus 26, verse 26. So that is the reason he is to eat this meager ration of bread. But they're going to eat it by weight and with fearfulness, in fear of the famine. Water will also be drunk by measure and also with dismay. Again, the point here is that the famine will accompany the siege of Jerusalem. It's going to enter into famine time. And in verse 17, it's going to be so intense that they will want bread and water. They'll not be able to find it and will be dismayed one with another and pine away in their iniquity. This is in fulfillment of Leviticus 26, verse 39. Leviticus 26, verse 39. The point of the first symbolic act was to teach the Jews that the siege of Jerusalem was coming. It's going to be followed by a second symbolic act, which taught how long the desolation would be once the city had fallen. And this third symbolic act shows them what will happen during the siege itself. It'll be devastated by famine. Now, the last symbolic act we see in chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, where Ezekiel is now told to shave his head. And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp sword, as a barber's razor shalt thou take it unto thee, and shall cause it to pass upon thy head and upon thy beard. Then take thee balances to weigh and divide the hair. A third part shalt thou burn in the fire in the midst of the city, when the days of the siege are fulfilled. And thou shalt take a third part and smite with the sword round about it. And the third part thou shalt scatter to the wind, and I'll draw out a sword after them. And thou shalt take thereof a few in number, and bind them in thy skirts. That's a few parts of the hair. And of these again shalt thou take and cast them into the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire. Therefrom shall a fire come forth into all the house of Israel. So, what's he talking about here? First one, we have the symbolic act. The fourth one, a sharp sword. It's to be used in two ways. First of all, it's to be used as a barber's razor. And second, as a symbolic weapon of war in verse 2, which we're going to see. He's to cause it to pass upon his head, which means he has to shave all the hair off his head, but he also has to shave off his beard. And this type of shaving of the head and face was done for one of two purposes. One was a sign of mourning, and we see this in Isaiah 15, verse 2, Isaiah 22, verse 12. We see it also in Amos chapter 8, verse 10, Jeremiah 16, 6, Jeremiah 48, 37, and Ezekiel 27, 31. So that's the first purpose. First purpose, it's a sign of mourning. Second purpose for doing this in ancient Israel was to symbolize disgrace or shame. Two examples we see: 2 Samuel 10, verse 4, and Ezekiel 7, verse 18. So the two purposes are for mourning or as a symbol of disgrace or shame. Then Ezekiel is then told to take the balances to weigh and divide the hair. He's being asked to do this to himself, and this to shave his head and beard. And remember, this is significant because he's a priest. The hair and beard of a priest was a mark of his consecration. And these actions were forbidden to a Levite who was functioning as a priest. And we find that in Leviticus 19, verse 27, and Leviticus 21, verse 5. So once again, God is asking Ezekiel to do something contrary to, so actually, is God asking Ezekiel to do something contrary to his own law? Well, no, he isn't, because Ezekiel is in captivity and he's not functioning as a priest. The priests are in Jerusalem. If he was functioning as a priest, then this action would mean a loss of his priesthood. Now in verse 2, he's told what to do with the hair he has shaved off his head and face. He has to weigh it in a balance and divide it into 3 separate portions. A third of it he has to burn in the fire. It says in the midst of the city, that is in relation to what he has drawn on that tablet. He is to do this once the days of the siege are fulfilled. The next third, he has to smite with the sword. So first he had to use the sword as a razor. Now this is a second use of the sword for the purpose of smiting. And ultimately, this sword symbolizes Nebuchadnezzar when he fulfills these prophecies upon Jerusalem. And then the last third of his hair, he is to scatter to the wind. Now, after he has done that, he is to draw a sword after them. So this is to show that even those who have gone into exile are going to experience persecution in the exile. Now in verse 3, he talks about a remnant. He says, thou shalt take thereof a few in number. Now, from this last third of his hair, before he throws this up into the wind, he has to take a few hairs and bind them in his skirt. Now, this refers to the extremities of his long tunic, which the men wore back then. It would be gathered up and it would be tucked into a belt so that the fold formed a sort of a pocket for the purpose of carrying things. We see it being used this way in Haggai chapter 2, verse 12. Now, Ezekiel is to take a few of the hairs from the last third of his shavings and put them into a pocket in his tunic. And that's going to represent a surviving remnant. Now, this is not the believing remnant, but simply a surviving remnant from the land. And then in verse 4, he talks about the fall of that remnant. And of these again shalt thou take, meaning from these last few strands of hair, which he has just pulled from the final third of his shaved hair, he's to take a few of them and cast them into the midst of the fire. The point of this here is to teach that even of those who manage to escape alive from Jerusalem when it falls, many of them are going to die in exile nonetheless. So even those who escape from Jerusalem, they're going to perish with Jerusalem, if not actually in the city itself. And here, the judgment will affect both those who are inside and those who are outside the city. And the point of this fourth symbolic act is to show that what will happen to the inhabitants of Jerusalem when it falls, therefore shall a fire come forth into all the house of Israel. And this is where we're going to leave it for this session, because in the next session we want to keep as a whole. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.